Hi, this is Matt Perez. This is our Hatchery Live show, and today we have Cliff Berg with us. And Cliff has been doing the Agile thing for a long, long time. He mentioned the thing about Apple II, and that dates him and us. And he's got a book that he's got up there, and so we're going to be talking to him about what he sees as a problem, what he sees as what they're doing today, and where we think we're heading. And with that, Cliff, you want to a brief intro yourself, and then get started.
Sure. Yeah. Well, thank you, Matt, and Jose. I have been in the career of one type or another for a long time, and as Matt said, my Agile journey started when the Agile movement started. I was 20 years into my career. At that time, I was CTO of a company that I had co-founded that had grown to 200 people, and we decided to adopt extreme programming, and that was in 2000. That was in 2000.
2000.
Manifesto. And it went well. And I realize now that it really went well mostly because the people who led those teams were really good. It wouldn't have mattered what method they chose. No matter what they had done, it would have gone well. But my Agile journey began in the context of a company that built some really difficult mission critical systems for McKesson Pharmaceuticals, Bank of America, Federal Express, Capital One Bank, United Overseas Bank, and in a context where lives aren't at stake, but money is at stake and company reputation's at stake. And these were nonstop systems that had to work, handling customer-facing, very often B2B data and real-time transactions. And the challenge was, we had our own performance testing system that we built on our own dollar. We did everything fixed price, by the way, and things worked. And my concern was how to move fast, but make sure that stuff really worked. And I ended up writing a book where I collected what I thought and what I had learned about that. And I actually collaborated with Peter Neumann on that, who has pretty good credentials and system reliability in systems. But I realized that in order to move fast, you really have to be intentional about how things work. And you also have to let that intention evolve because you're constantly learning. And that really was the core of agility for building high reliability systems, to be intentional, to have a working design, to have the assurance argument, so to speak, which is, the concept for how it's why you think it will be reliable, why you think it will really work and really will scale.
So what has happened? What has happened since then? That has that changed, or does the need change? Does the methodology change? Is Agile? All those things.
Well, yes and no. Agile is different things to different people, and I have a lot of debates. I'm pretty active in LinkedIn. I try to be very accessible, and I'm very happy to engage with people in discussions. I try to always be polite. I try to, sometimes I slip up, but I try to do my part to make social media a pleasant place and not an antagonistic place. So I try to always stick to the issue. But I find that in discussions about some of these things, most people tend to see things in a very fluid way and think generally that to be agile, you have to be contextual. But there are some people who think that being agile is kind of this very precisely defined thing and that there's a best way. And I strongly reject that, but politely, with respect, I reject that. I think it's completely contextual. I don't think you can define best practice for these things. I think you can have patterns for people to consider. But then they need to adjust those patterns. They need to take the ideas of those patterns and then come up with their own approach, not copy the pattern. They need to take the idea and then figure out, is that idea useful? And then figure out how they might use that idea to create their own process or their own template or their own whatever. Because there are lots of good ideas out there, but you have to adjust them for you because people are different. People are neurodiverse. Some people are very effective doing test-driven development, for example, or pairing, and some people are not and never will be, no matter how long they try to do it, because they're neurologically different. And that is not something to be ashamed of or being labeled as you're not agile or something. It's being giving people agency about how they work.
Cliff, I want to jump in because as I'm listening, I'm thinking of myself and Matt and going, yep, this all makes sense to us. And then I'm wondering, well, is it making sense to the audience? Because maybe not everybody knows what Agile's about. And so could you give us just a thumbnail of what was before Agile, what was Agile, and what's Agile 2?
Well, it's followed kind of an interesting arc. As I said, in 2000, 2001, I was 20 years into my career, and I saw a lot of change before that. During the 80s, things were very freewheeling, and some of the most agile teams I had ever been on were during the 1980s. During the 1980s, I was on a series of teams at two companies where I worked, Intermetrics and CAD Language Systems, where we collaborated constantly. Even though we had our own offices, we collaborated constantly. We ran fully automated integration tests every night. Fully automated integration tests every night. We worked against a feature backlog. We had team leads who were project managers, quote unquote, but they were not what you think of today when you think of project manager. They were people who were really immersed in the work, and in those cases were very inquisitive and empowering, and when they came in the room, you were happy. You weren't afraid. You were thinking, oh, Carl's here. We're going to have a really deep discussion about stuff. Carl, we're working on this. What do you think? And he would never boss you around and tell you what to do. When he left, you felt like someone really helpful had just been there. That was the project manager. I hesitate to call him a servant leader because he was more than that. Servant leadership is a really kind of insufficient model for the kinds of leadership that are needed. It's an important mode, but it's just a mode of leadership. You need more than that. But what happened, after the 80s, you saw the rise of PMI, and a lot of organizations, probably most large organizations, decided that they needed to have software development methodologies. And most of them based it on some kind of waterfall approach. And that all arose during the 90s. Before that, it wasn't like that. And it got worse and worse and worse. And when the Agile Manifesto came out, it was a rejection of all that. It basically was, this phase-based stuff doesn't work. We need to go back to these things. It was about going back to. It wasn't new. It was return.
Under a new name, under a new philosophy.
Under a new, which happens very often in culture, where old ideas get reaggregated and then there's a new label. I like to point out that, the pyramids, before the Great Pyramid at Gaza was built, they had built a little pyramid and then a slightly larger one and then a larger one and then a larger, and then the pyramid, So when they were building the pyramids, they started small and then they tried and big and bigger and bigger.
I wonder if they had a different label on the first one.
I'm sure they did.
Pyramid 1, Pyramid 2, Pyramid 3.
Yeah. So most of this stuff is not new. It's just relabeled or kind of rethought. And, but then, when the Agile Manifesto, well, first of all, extreme programming really launched the Agile movement in the US. In the Europe, there were some other things, but in the US, it really was extreme programming. And it was all about XP. And you heard people talking about XP. Have you tried XP? Should we try XP? Well, in my company, we did. But then the Agile Manifesto was created, a 2 years later after the XP book came out. And then it became about, and not XP, it became about Agile. But what's interesting is that XP and Agile are actually kind of opposites, because XP is extreme. By definition, it even says it's extreme programming. The Agile Manifesto is the opposite of extreme. We value all these things, but this more than that. So it's all about judgment and context, not about extremes. So the Agile Manifesto was the opposite of extreme programming. A lot of people miss that. But then what happened is, after that, you had kind of XP and Scrum, which existed prior, jumping on the Agile bandwagon to kind of benefit from that, claiming retroactively that they're Agile. And maybe they are in some way, but they're not the same as the Agile Manifesto. They're something else. And then the Agile movement took its own arc, and a lot of really good ideas developed, and a lot of really bad ideas developed too. And you saw this mixture of great ideas and toxic ideas within the same thing. And a lot of the toxic ideas really took root. And some of them came sort of from the manifesto, from some, I think maybe misinterpretation of the intent. And, my favorite is the one about self-organizing teams. And, it literally says the correct thing. It says that the best thing comes from self-organizing teams. But what it doesn't say is that that's a rare case. In order for teams, if you have a large organization, an ecosystem, to expect that teams will self-organize and perform well, there are preconditions for that. The organization really needs to have a very healthy culture, what some models call a constructive culture or generative culture. And you have to have teams where the individuals on the team have relatively high EQ. And if you have those conditions, you will tend to see self-organizing teams, because people in leadership roles who constitute teams will take people and put them together and have confidence. Yeah, they'll be able to do that. I don't need to mess with them. Go do that. And they will. But in most organizations, it won't work that way. Because most organizations do not have a very healthy culture, and the people do not have, by and large, a high EQ. And so it won't work. And, in the fairly recent book, Accelerate, by Nicole Forsgren and Juz Humble and Gene Kim, Forsgren documents her research, and which was very extensive. And she found that the teams that had the highest performance were the teams that had transformational leadership, not self-organizing. So there were a lot of things, a lot of narratives that emerged within the Agile community that were extreme or that weren't quite right, and kind of made it very dysfunctional. And the goal of Agile 2 was to kind of reset and think, what is real agility? Forget Agile. What's real agility for organizations, and what does it come from? And, kind of starting with a clean slate and being more scientific about it, looking at what we know in behavioral psychology and leadership theory and cognitive science and operations research. And because a lot has been done in those fields to identify like what happens when groups of people come together. What actually happens? What's the behavior you tend to see? And how do you get groups of people to be effective? And how do people communicate well? It's not just face to face. That's a very simplified view that you just have people talking. Real collaboration about complex issues. We like to say it's reading, writing, talking, listening, and thinking. You need all those things in different balance at different times, depending on the life cycle of the issue, the discussion, and how complex it is, and so on. And so, it's not so simple. And and we wanted to, there's a lot we know from cognitive science about how people think and create, and, do they need to collaborate a lot? Do they also need to isolate? I was just listening today to a podcast or interview, and the topic came up of the incredible importance of solitude for creativity.
Mhm.
So, collaboration is absolutely essential. So is solitude. And different people need them in different measure. So none of this is simple. You can't take something like an Agile manifesto, which is basically a bunch of bumper stickers, and that's not meant in a critical way, because bumper stickers are good. They have their place. They remind us, but they're not guidance. In order to understand something like the manifesto, you already have to understand all of those things. You have to have thought about it for decades, read books about it, discussed it, experienced and lived it. Then the manifesto makes sense. And then you'll realize what it's missing. It doesn't mention anything about leadership, which is probably the most important thing of all. And it says nothing about it. But it's okay. It's okay. It doesn't, if we expect it to be this perfect thing where people are parsing the words like a religious document, and that, the answer must be there. We just have to think about it the right way. No, the answer might not be there, and some of it might be wrong. And that's okay. It's a great set of reminders. It's not perfect. It's not sufficient. Yeah.
So what are you doing about it? You wrote a book, but what other things are you doing about it, and what are your clients doing about it? What are you pushing your clients to do about it? And more from the perspective of where do we get to a point where people recognize that they have to have a high IQ, they have to be good listening, they have to be good expressing themselves. It's one thing to tell somebody, oh, you got to do this, as opposed to, hey, we need to do this. How do we do it? And have them take ownership of that. So I get all that, but what's happening? What are you doing? What are they doing?
Well, after the Agile 2 team finished its work, and we very quickly wrote a book, which is a 400-page book, and we wrote it and published it through a major publisher, Wiley, in 3 months. And that included all of the rounds of editing that happened. And people said it couldn't be done, but
Wow.
I was determined that we were going to do it. But after, there was a reason why. There was a conference that I wanted the book to be out for. But anyway, we then thought about, how can we help people to use these ideas? And, in the Agile community, immediately people assume that, well, you've created a framework and now you're going to have certification or something like that. We didn't do that. There's no framework. Agile 2 is not a framework. Think of it as the Agile manifesto, but much broader, more complete, and with explanatory narrative. There's no how-to in it. There's no how-to. There's no methodology. There's no framework. There's no practices in Agile 2. And it was published effectively open source because it's Creative Commons published. So anyone could write a book and repeat the entire Agile 2 principles without violating anything. And that was intentional. So someone could create training courses if they wanted to. So I put a group together and the intention of that group, Agile 2 Academy, is to help people to use these ideas, to help them use the ideas, because people do need help. And, there's a lot of value. I think that's very authentic. We're not selling some kind of process to always run or something. We help people. And, we did create a course, but it's not a certification, and it doesn't regurgitate Agile 2. You don't learn Agile 2 in the course. What you learn is the foundational things that help you to implement the ideas of Agile 2. So the course starts out with 4 modules about leadership theory, what we know from research, path goal theory and transformational leadership and leader-member exchange theory, and all these different models and how they work and why they're useful for thinking about situations. It doesn't say do this and do that. It gives you models for how to think about things. And then the course goes into some cognitive science and behavioral science, behavioral psychology. The trans-theoretical model, for example, is a foundational model in behavioral therapy that explains how people change over time. And there are other models that, and what we know from how people think in System 1 and System 2 thinking, according to Daniel Kahneman's model. And then some things from operations research, which happens to be one, I have a degree in that. And so I was able to pull some things for that because lean and flow are kind of lenses of using operations research or vice versa. There's a lot of lean and flow that it's kind of interesting from an operations research perspective. So the Agile 2 Foundations course, we call it Foundations because it doesn't teach you Agile 2. It teaches you the things you need to that will be helpful to actually use the ideas in Agile 2. And it's not a certification because I don't think it should be. We don't, in college, you don't take one course and then get a degree. You know, you take a whole
somebody could take your book and stuff like that and create a certification program, right?
They could, and that would be okay, because, I've been told by a number of people who names you'd recognize, by the way, that you have to create certification because that's what drives acceptance. But we've just resisted doing that. I think, certification is something that there should be a very high bar. My nephew is a certified financial planner and financial analyst. He's got 2 certifications. And the test for that, each of those took a whole weekend, 16 hours. And he studied for a year. So, to me, a certification should be something that is a really significant bar, not one course. It should be a whole curriculum of courses. So if someone wants to create an Agile 2 certification, fine. We're not going to. But we do have a course that we think has a lot of value. And it also has been really useful for our clients that where we're helping to use these ideas because it gives people, especially people in leadership roles, foundational knowledge that now we have a vocabulary for how to talk about things. We run workshops with people to help them to think through and generate their ideas, but we also do some instruction. We pull things from the course, depending on what issues we're talking about, to give them a little bit of instruction so that now have a model and a vocabulary, and then we let them loose again and have them come up with ideas. So we alternate diagnostic, instruction, generation, dialogic activity, and we alternate between those modes and ending up with a completely generative mode where people come up with their own solutions. And, that's been working really well. And then people end up having a very strong sense of ownership. They're not implementing any framework. They came up with it, so they understand what they came up with. And they're the ones who are in a position to be accountable and to improve it and make it get better and better and better and better.
Cliff, you just mentioned something there that speaks to something that we're very strong on, which is the question of ultimately, at the end of the day, can teams be independent enough when there is an ownership structure and a management structure that is the traditional that we know, the mainstream systems? What are your thoughts about that? Do you think that the system as it stands can actually allow for that to happen?
Absolutely, because structure is not the problem.
Okay.
Structure is not the problem. Very often large organizations need structure in order to decompose, how they fund things or how they where people sit. It has to be composable. So a group has to compose into another group. But how people behave is a whole different thing. And the old model, the old hierarchical company, makes identical the structure and the behavior. You collaborate within your group. If you want to go to another group, you talk to your boss. Your boss then talks to that boss or gives you permission. It's always up and down the hierarchy.
Right.
That doesn't work today. It's too slow. It's actually very toxic. It creates all kinds of dysfunction. It creates territories. What highly agile organizations need, and the highly agile companies that we looked at, you see of completely fluid interaction across organizational lines, completely fluid. And in fact, you see people in leadership roles making that happen dynamically, not in a kind of planning way, but dynamically as issues come up. Getting people to reach out, go talk to that other group, you and you and you, solve that problem. Oh, there's a problem there. Okay. Who else do you need to talk to? Go talk to them, solve that problem. And it doesn't matter where they sit. And the fact that there is structure, that structure is being used only for allocating funds or where people sit or something. It's not being used to organize how people actually work.
And you think that, like you just said about allocating funds. So I'm a team, we're very innovative. We want to do something different, but somebody else is allocating funds. The structure is still mandating what this team is capable of doing, be it from a management perspective or a budgeting perspective. I understand what you're saying about, I totally agree with you. There are environments where managers say, screw the system, we're just going to work together and make this work. But that's rare. In today's world, that's very rare. As I'm sure you've noted in your book. The question then is, how do you see those limitations becoming overcome? Because they're still constraining teams from being as creative and innovative as they want to be in many cases.
Yeah,
and you have 2 minutes.
We have 2 minutes?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, very quickly, it's the behavior of the managers, and that starts at the top. People sit in places in an organization, and then basically that's how they get their paycheck. But that doesn't have to be how they spend their day. Just because they sit here doesn't mean they can't go work over there for 2 weeks or 2 months or work. It doesn't matter where they sit. They need to solve a problem with these other people. Why does it matter where they're getting their paycheck from?
Because they have to report.
That's the problem. It goes to the managers who are expecting that people will work on their stuff. Instead of the manager, owning a problem, I want to solve this problem. And to solve that problem, I need some people from another group. Let me go talk to that leader over there. Okay, we're all trying to solve these problems. And they just forget about who's getting paid by what. They're all being paid by the organization. And so the incentives at the highest levels have to be aligned for that to work. There has to be. Yeah.
And what you're describing, though, is I think a critical aspect of what we are focused on, which is you have to have a system, a structure that supports that type of agility.
And incentive
structure. And when you don't, that's really, really hard. And so that speaks to the question that we're really strongly pay attention to, which is, can you really have a self-managed team within an organization that does not have that kind of mindset?
No, the organizational culture and the incentives originate, from the culture and vice versa. Which came first? It doesn't matter. They influence each other. You have to fix the incentives. You have to fix the culture, which is basically the behaviors and expectations at the people who have the most influence, which is the people with the most positional authority. If you don't fix that, then you're hobbled constantly.
Awesome. Well, Matt, do you want to wrap up or?
Yeah, we're out of time. Unfortunately, this was really interesting. I could have kept listening and talking to you for a while. Let me see who's next. So thank you very much, Jeff, for your time. And obviously, you thought about this a lot, and come up with a very good approach to not spread dogma, which is the problem with the manifesto and things like that. And in any case, the next interview next week, I think, is Aimena Krolla, founder of Cumbia. It's a consulting and change maker. And we're going to see what she's done and what she thinks the problem is and the usual stuff that we do here. And we expect you guys to listen to that one as well. And with that, I think we're done.
Thanks again, Cliff.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thanks.